Welcome to another edition of the Mideast News Hour. Last Monday, the FBI raided Donald Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida. In Israel, we've had a lot of revelations about the nature of the legal system on the part of Moshe Sada, who was the former deputy head of the police investigations unit, which is part of the state prosecutions unit that's in charge of all of it's like the internal affairs in Israel that's responsible for investigating suspicions of criminal wrongdoing on the part of cops. And so there's a lot going on in terms of what we're learning and what we're seeing about the nature of the deep state in the United States and in Israel. And obviously, viewers here, listeners here to the show can learn a lot about what's happening in the United States and how the FBI and the Democrats and the media are targeting Trump and his associates. But I think it's important to also walk back to Israel because we're in such a similar situation here in terms of the criminalization of opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu and his supporters and of the right wing in general in Israel. And so I could think of nobody better to discuss all of this with than my friend and my colleague, Professor Avi Bell from Bar Ilan University's Law School and University of San Diego Law School, who is an expert on this issue. He was a member of the team of lawyers who tried to explain to then Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit that his bribery indictment against Netanyahu had no parallel in the world of democracy and history, and we can get into that a little bit too. We want to talk about what's happening with Netanyahu's trial as well. So without further ado, welcome Avi to the show again. We're glad to have you back. I'm glad. We, the royal we. I'm happy to have you back. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, anytime that I can have my good friends on, I think it's important, and it's more fun that way for me. But also, I think that this is very important. So let's talk for a second about what we learned from Moshe Sada, who was the deputy chief of the police investigations unit. He came out of public service last week and gave a major. Or 2 weeks ago, when he gave a major interview to Amit Segal from Israel's Channel 12, and then he gave a follow-on interview, very importantly, on Channel 14 with Errol Segal. So let's talk a little bit about what he exposed. Why don't you start walking us through, and I'll just add,
Yeah. What he first of all, just Moshe Sada, you should know, is the former deputy head of the police investigations division, which means that he was primarily involved in internal affairs. And what he described is a series of cases that he was involved with where either there were prosecutions that seemed to him bizarre, and more importantly, cases of obstruction of justice where there was criminal activity that should have been investigated, should have been prosecuted, and the cases were closed. And he says it was primarily because the police and the Attorney General's office, the Solicitor General's office, wanted to avoid adverse publicity while they were trying to take down the Prime Minister on dubious criminal charges. So he outlined a number of different episodes where they obstructed justice, where they shut down prosecutions. The two most striking ones. One of them is about a senior police official who was accused of sexual assault and sexual harassment, where a new police chief came in, Roni Al-Sheikh, who ended up being one of Netanyahu's primary opponents, gave all sorts of interviews accusing Netanyahu of very strange wrongdoing, claimed that Netanyahu had sent spies after him and like. At any rate, Al-Sheikh came in and shut down all prosecutions, basically, of sexual harassment and sexual assault by police. And Ronnie Rittman was the first and primary beneficiary of this, says Saada. He says the reason Rittman was chosen to get this protection was because Rittman at the time was running an investigation against Netanyahu for alleged wrongdoing in a variety of trivialities, like raiding the petty funds for recycling, yeah, and buying things for the prime minister's residence, or ordering in meals for not for himself, but for the dying father-in-law, his dying father-in-law, who was at the time spending time with the prime minister's family. And a variety of other trivialities. The investigation went on for several years. It ended up resulting in criminal charges against the prime minister's wife at the time, and a plea bargain in which she agreed to accept guilt in some lesser form of fraud, and said, Saada, the only reason that Ronnie Rittman was getting away with sexual assault and sexual harassment was because the police did not want any adverse publicity. Ronnie Al-Sheikh did not want any adverse publicity about the police department. And so, they had more important things to do, like go after the prime minister. Now, that's one of the episodes. The other big explosive episode is about a case in which it's about, at this point, it's about almost 7 years ago, when there was a police raid on a Bedouin settlement in the Negev desert, where someone was killed. The raid on the settlement was because it was illegal, right? The settlement was basically, it was a bunch of Bedouin families that had trespassed on state land and built a rogue settlement. The police had come in to remove them from the state lands, and during the course of this, someone was shot. One of the Bedouins who was living there was in his vehicle. The police said that he tried to run them over, that it was a terrorist attack, and he was shot. It turns out that he was not, right? He was not a terrorist. He was not trying to run anyone over. What exactly happened is not entirely clear, but he lost control of the vehicle, maybe, or it may simply be the police shot indiscriminately, and he lost control of the vehicle after being shot. But whatever it is, it's very clear that the police claims at the time that there was no police wrongdoing, and that this was a man who was connected with ISIS or some other terrorist group, are completely wrong. Now, in this case, again, Al-Sheikh, the police chief at the time, shut down the investigation, and says Saada, the Solicitor General at the time, Shai Nitzan, who everyone knows was the guy who was responsible for going after Netanyahu, wrote several emails in which he said that Al-Sheikh's behavior here is outrageous, right? That it's clear that Al-Sheikh is lying when he's telling the media that this guy is a terrorist, that Al-Sheikh's trying to obstruct investigations into police wrongdoing, in not only in the shooting itself, but in the cover-up thereafter. And Nitzan knows all of this, but he put in an email, he said, we can't look into this, as outrageous as Al-Sheikh's behavior is. If we say anything in public, it will be used against us, and smart people will understand what I'm talking about. Right? The sort of broad hint, like we can't do this because Netanyahu is going to benefit because it'll prove that enforcement is political. And so Sada talked about this past week, but the truth is those emails were revealed to the public 2 years ago.
Right, but I think that there's something important about somebody who was actually in the room at the time discussing that, that he's actually a whistleblower. I mean, that he's saying, yes, everything that you thought you understood about Shai Nitzan and Roni Alshech were true. That they subordinated the rule of law in Israel. They subordinated, they quelled investigations, criminally quelled obstructive investigations, because everything had to be cast away that could possibly pose an obstacle to criminalizing the sitting prime minister. I mean, that's
what we're looking at is somebody from the inside blowing the whistle on obstruction of justice and other related crimes, interfering with witnesses, interfering with evidence, right? A variety of crimes that are all designed for the PR of the police and the state prosecutors. And the specific motivations for those cover-ups were to clear the way for the prosecution to go after Netanyahu. That's what he says. And the evidence is there. It's been there for several years. And the reason it is important, not only that he said it, but that it was mentioned that the email came out 2 years ago, is because when it came out 2 years ago, a complaint was filed before the ombudsman that this is obstruction of justice and wrongdoing. And the ombudsman said, no, there's no problem here. The email was private and emotional and does not mention Netanyahu by name, and therefore should not be thought to be obstruction of justice. Now, what that tells us is that the cover-ups here, they're not simply between the police and the prosecutors. It's also of the so-called oversight mechanisms, right? I mean, everybody is watching out for everybody else to protect this circle of corruption. And I'll tell you something else that came out this week that shows us more or less the same thing. There was a shocking report several months ago in the Calcalist newspaper. And Calcalist had reported that the police had been criminally hacking into the phones of a variety of different people, politicians, journalists, members of the Netanyahu family, and the response of the police and the prosecutors to this exposure was to claim that everything was legal.
Right.
They didn't deny, by the way, that they'd been hacking into all these phones. They said that it was all legal. And the report came out this week. It's the Justice Ministry appointed somebody to look into it, and you can guess what.
It's actually important to discuss who it was that they appointed. Who was it? The Justice Minister Gideon Sa'ar appointed to investigate this. He appointed the woman Amit Miara, who oversaw all of these, the entire operation. So it's not even that you're telling the cat to guard the cream. It's that I mean, it's even worse than that, because it's not that she wants to eat the cream, it's that she is the cream. I mean, she was the one doing
it. Exactly. She was appointed to investigate
what she already did.
Her own wrongdoing. And of course, she came out with a report. There's a 100-page report that says that there was no serious wrongdoing. There was minor wrongdoing. It's all trivial.
But this was from last year, because there was an initial Miara report that already said everything.
There was a preliminary report which said that there was no wrongdoing, and now this 100-page report just came out this past week, and it regurgitates the original findings. And I think that you have to understand part of the game, the way it's played here. A central part of the report is that it says it doesn't deny that there were these that all these phones were hacked into and all this information was taken. What it says is that it was all approved by law. And you have to understand the trick there. The trick is that the various laws that restrict police hacking into phones allow the attorney general to give an okay, or a court to give an okay into hacking if there's a suspicion of a felony. And so one of the things that the prosecution did in order to go after Netanyahu was it fabricated these new crimes. It's it said it's a crime of bribery for a politician to solicit positive media coverage. It sounds like a joke, but it's taken seriously enough by the attorney general and by the courts that if you suspect that a politician is trying to get positive media coverage, then you're suspecting him of a felony, and therefore you have a right to hack into his phones and the phones of his family members and the phones of the journalists that he's talking to, and just everybody under the sun. And so
well, and all his advisors, because they're all involved in his media relations, right? Especially against people, but not only them.
Right. And so what you have is that the report is
and
covering
his wife,
up
right? And also his wife, because they
his wife
hacked into Avner Netanyahu's phone that Sarah was apparently using, so that they were.
It's a license to steal, right? It's basically by creating this fake felony, they can go after anybody. They can get a now. One of the other things that Sada was talking about was he was talking about the way the police and the prosecutors are abusing surveillance powers, right? So he mentioned another case of a senior police official who was engaged in sexual assault, and he said that if we're allowed to get into his phone, we can collect the key evidence. And the prosecutor, Shai Nitzan, the same, the Solicitor General, the same guy who was going after Netanyahu and letting everybody else off the hook, said absolutely not. Now, while he was doing this,
while he protected the policeman who from
protected the policeman
from these searches.
While he was protecting the policeman, he was okaying the illegal use of hacked information from of a lawyer named Efi Naveh, who was the head of the Bar Association at the time. And the reason Efi Naveh was on their target list was because Efi Naveh was approving conservative rather than progressive judges, progressive activist judges. And so Efi Naveh was enemy number one in the prosecutor's office at the time because they support progressive activist judges. They certainly don't support conservative judges. And so the illegal hack into his phone was, of course, had to be okay. And they also, the prosecution.
And wait, I gotta take a step back just to make clear how terrible it is. So hold that thought for a second, just so you guys understand. Efi Naveh, as the head of the Bar Association, Israel's crazy judicial selection system makes him a member of the committee that approves judicial appointments. Okay, so he has not only is he an advocate, but he's actually a participant in the appointment of judges. And that's one thing. The other thing is that, as opposed to, say, the search that Sada proposed against the police officer who was suspected of sexual assault, that would have been a police search. That would have been a search that was legally constituted, that you had the permission of the attorney general or of a duly constituted court or whatever to do this. But Efi Naveh's cell phone was hacked illegally by a reporter. and then she began to publish hacked information that she received from Effie Nave's cell phone. These were felony offenses, if I understand correctly.
That's
And
absolutely correct.
Shiny, so her entire operation was a felony, was felonious, and she committed multiple felonies in order to report this salacious information that she hacked from Effie Nave's cell phone, which she received. I don't know if it's illegally, because she got it from his wife, who was in the process of getting a divorce from him. So I don't know what that would be called. But
it was the right, but it was his phone, not the wife's phone. The wife, he never gave permission for his cell phone to be hacked into. The search was therefore illegal by anyone, not just by the prosecutor's office, but by private individuals.
right, and thinking, and
And the
Shiny
prosecutor's
Sun,
office.
but let me just finish. So Shiny Sun, just to understand how completely twisted this is, Shiny Sun gave the journalist criminal immunity for no particular reason, right? I mean, like, there was no.
He gave her criminal immunity, and so that they could bring charges against Effie Navin. This is I was gonna what I wanted to complete the
So go on,
story here.
But I just wanted to make sure that
like,
Effie itself was important because he was a participant, not an advocate. He is on the Judicial Selections Committee.
Right, he's on the Judicial Selection Committee, and therefore he was a key person, a key vote to getting conservative judges. And so he had to be gotten rid of if you want to maintain control of judicial appointments. And so they came up with, Shiny Sun came up with another theory, another interesting bribery theory. What came out of the hacked phones was that Effie Naved apparently had an affair with a judge.
Not just one, but okay, yeah.
Right. He had apparently had an affair with, well, it's a particular judge that we're interested in. And says Shiny Sun, well, if Nefi Nave was having an affair with a judge, then, and the judge was looking to get promoted, then that's bribery. Why is it bribery? Because the judge is giving Effie Nave sex in exchange for his potential vote on the committee. Now, if it's insane to suggest that giving positive coverage to a politician or to a public official is bribery, then it is doubly insane to say that giving somebody sex, like consensual sex, is a bribe. I mean, who is not involved in bribery in public life then? I mean, everybody's accepting bribes all the time. If you're married, if you're having an affair, if you have a girlfriend, boyfriend, but the point in doing all this was that the felony accusation was not designed. I mean, it wasn't designed to win a conviction. And by the way, the charges were dropped. What it was designed to do was to besmirch Effie Nave and drive him out of his position, which it did. Right, he was forced to resign, and I think that's exactly the way to see the Netanyahu charges. The Netanyahu charges, the prosecutor's a little bit shocked because the whole point of the charges, these idiotic charges that Netanyahu is accepting bribes in the form of media coverage that's less hostile than the usual. Right. The point of the charges was to force him to resign. I don't think that there was any real expectation that they would have to hold these charges up in court. And so as we're now going into
and Netanyahu actually got that stated to him explicitly, I think by Amnon Abramovich, right, on Channel 12, who's one of the regime reporters, right, that essentially said that all of this could be forgiven, all of this would be dropped if Netanyahu dropped out of the race for prime minister. I think this was in 2019 or 20 in one of the successive elections that we went through.
Yeah,
So I mean, proposed
it's
already.
it hasn't changed since then, right? I mean, what you've seen is, you know, these ideas floated in the media. Maybe there can be a plea bargain as long as Netanyahu agrees to accept that he can never run for public office again. The editor of the Jerusalem Post suggested that the president ought to pardon Netanyahu for these crimes, not because the editor likes Netanyahu. He hates Netanyahu. He says so explicitly. He says that the reason is that this case is becoming um, the most singular embarrassment to the prosecution in the history of Israel and will destroy its reputation permanently. And so he says Netanyahu should be pardoned, but of course only if Netanyahu agrees to leave public life forever. Right? And it's pretty clear that there's an understanding that the point of this is the charges are part of the political game, and they're designed to drive people out of office or drive people out of positions. That criminal charges are used selectively in order to achieve political aims, and it's, you know, we had a number of different events of this week that highlighted that, but it's not new. It's been going on for years. By the way, I have to say I'm very sad to report, in my opinion, the revelations of this week will not change anything. I don't think that the prosecution is going to let go, or the police are not going to let go of their attempt to consolidate their power over the elections, over elected officials, over the prime minister's office, over the courts. They're not going to let go of that until they're forced to, until they're marched into jail. And they control the process of prosecuting themselves, and so they will never agree. Right? There's no way that the current prosecutor will ever agree to prosecute Shai Nitzan for obstruction of justice, or Roni al-Sheikh for obstruction of justice. It's not going to happen.
Well, you know, I don't remember whether we spoke about this on an earlier podcast that you were on, or whether we've just spoken about it in private conversations. But you know, there's sort of a you distinguish yourself from other critics of the legal processes against Netanyahu, like our friend Moshe Kovarsky, who I've had on the show, where they believe that by destroying the testimony, by showing the absurdity and the criminal nature of the prosecution with witness after witness, and we'll go into the details of what's happening with Netanyahu's trial in a minute, that Netanyahu is going to be exonerated, that the judges in the Jerusalem District Court are going to be forced to find him not guilty. And you know, you take it from a different perspective. You've argued that that can't happen. So can you explain a little bit why you think that the particulars of the indictments don't really matter?
Yeah. So let me just first reinforce what you just said. Right. What's happened in the Netanyahu trial, we're about a year into it almost, and it's going to go on for a lot longer. But the big guns of the prosecution are out there already. Right? They've had the testimony of their chief witnesses.
All of their star witnesses, every single one of their star witnesses has already appeared.
Right, and one after another.
Except for Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid is also.
Right. And they will do their very best to make sure that he goes to court after the elections. But one after another, these star witnesses have been unable to support the factual allegations in the charge sheet. In many cases, they've undermined it, shown the claims of the prosecution, the factual claims of the prosecution, to be false. And I think that it's a fair thing to say that at this point, the prosecution has failed to prove none of the facts that they allege. Now,
they failed to prove all of the facts.
They have to prove all of them, and they proved none of them.
Okay.
Right. But I don't think that makes a difference. And the reason is that the charges are designed to bring about a conviction no matter what facts are proved. All right, so let me, the two chief charges, the so-called cases of 2000 and 4000, are that Netanyahu requested or actually received less hostile media coverage while doing the things that a prime minister does, right? That is acting in office, making decisions. Now, I can guarantee you that every single politician in a democracy on the face of this planet is guilty of the crime of carrying out their duties of office while soliciting positive media coverage or trying to reduce the hostility of media coverage. I mean, that's the ABCs of democracy, is that if you are an elected official, you're trying to get your case out to the media. You are trying to get the media to cover you positively and not cover you negatively. And by the way, it's not just elected officials, it's senior bureaucrats too. They're doing the same thing. I mean, Shai Nitzan is doing the same thing, but everybody's guilty of this. Okay. Now, what does it mean that the prosecution hasn't been able to prove the facts as they exist in the charge sheet? It just means that they never expected this to go to court. They always expected Netanyahu would resign, right? But are they going to be able to prove that Netanyahu looked for less hostile media coverage, that he looked for more positive media coverage? Of course they are. Everybody does it. Everybody in the history of democracies has done this, right? And so there's going to be material there to convict somebody of this crime as long as you accept it's a crime. Now, no court in the history of the democratic world has ever convicted someone on a claim that media coverage is bribery. But for the court to reject that pretend crime, first of all, if this court were going to reject it, it should have rejected it already. It should have thrown out the charge sheets at the beginning of the trial, right? Said there's no crime here, but they didn't. And second of all, they understand that at the end, if they fail to convict on this, they fail to accept that it's a crime. If they fail to convict Netanyahu, they're going to be destroying the reputation of the prosecution, because they will show that this was an empty case to begin with. And I don't think that the judges want to do that. I think that they want to protect the reputation of the prosecution more than they want to do justice in this case. And so the result, I think, is no matter how this plays out, no matter how much egg is on their face, no matter how much the prosecution continues to show that it acted corruptly in putting together this case, and it acted incompetently in believing that it has a case, no matter how much that happens, I think that at the end of this, there's a conviction.
I think there are two aspects to this. One is that, we've talked a lot about the way that the prosecution in Israel makes up laws and how they selectively enforce the laws that actually exist. And I want to go also back to the whole spying thing, because I think it's enormously important. But I guess exoneration of Netanyahu also criminalizes, in a way, the entire method, that you can just say whatever is a crime, whatever you can say whatever you want to is a crime, and it would require the prosecution to actually work in accordance with Israeli law as it actually exists, as it's been passed over the years by the Knesset, and not give them this kind of leeway where they can decide what is a crime and what isn't a crime, and what should be investigated and what shouldn't be investigated based on their institutional or political interests at any given moment. But let's go back for a second to the Pegasus story, because I mean, this I think is just such a huge story that you have. You have the police using a counterterrorism tool that was developed to infiltrate the communications of Israel's enemies, and they're using it against the prime minister's son. and they're using it against the prime minister's spokespeople, and they're using it against the prime minister's friends, and they're doing it without any sort of legal basis. I mean, what does that? It's so terrifying that they can do it against the prime minister's family. Why would anybody feel that their rights are going to be protected in Israel? I mean, I find it so, and they're getting it away. They're getting away with it. You know, they appointed themselves to check. They said everything that we did was great. Move on, and the media is supporting that narrative as well. And the media here is acting as the Ministry of Information.
Yeah, there's two aspects to this. So first of all, it uses what we were just talking about. Everything is a crime in Israel. What I mean is not that everything in the books is a crime, but the prosecution, together with the police and the courts, gradually created this bizarre interpretation of almost every crime in the books that makes anyone who's charged almost certainly guilty. Right? I mean, you can get convicted in Israel of being a politician that wants the media to speak nicely about you. I mean, right? Everything is a crime. And
well, if you're not on their side, but if you're
no, it's everything is a crime. No. Everything is a crime. How is it then that the prosecution enforces this selectivity so that Netanyahu is guilty of this crime of seeking positive media coverage, but Lapid is not, and Shai Nitzan is not, and the Attorney General is not? And the answer is what they call lack of public interest. Right? They'll get to say, yeah, it may be that Lapid did things that are, problematic, but there's no public interest in prosecution. And so this creates a perfect system in which you can charge anybody you want to, be near certain of a conviction, and not charge anybody else, right? You're the people you want to protect. Whether you want to protect them for your own reasons, like you don't want bad publicity, or you're protecting them because they're political allies, or you're protecting them for whatever other reason, right? The people you protect, there's no public interest, and you just close it that way, right? That's how they shut down the case on Ronnie Rittman for sexual assault, sexual harassment. No public interest in going any further.
He allegedly sexually harassed. He didn't just allegedly sexually harass some person on the street. He allegedly sexually harassed, attacked, assaulted a senior officer in the police force. I mean, she also is a member of the police. She's not a civilian. So he attacked somebody else in the police, and he got off scot-free for it. So even being in the system doesn't protect you if you're not
let me just protect you again. This is all, these charges are alleged.
I said alleged 3 times. What do you want from me, counselor? I said 3 times.
Right. But so one part of this is that there's absolute discretion at the hands of the prosecution. Go after anybody they want to, and be certain of conviction if they make the charge, and to not go after anybody else. And they use this power. It's all these examples, and you can bring hundreds, thousands of other examples. These powers are used, to enhance the powers of the prosecution, right? To put them in charge, to give them control over the political system, to give them control over the bureaucracy, and to advance. I think this is a point that you want to make, that advance an ideological agenda, right? They want to go after their ideological opponents and advance their ideological allies. But there's another thing about this, which is there is, and this is simply shocking, the degree to which it's true. There is an out and out assault on the free media that is the lifeblood of a democracy.
Okay, here, let me just interrupt you for 1 second, because I want to talk. That was the next situation that I want to get to. So you'll talk about it, but I want to set it up. Okay, so when you and Alan Dershowitz and others argued before Mandelblit in Netanyahu's hearing, was it September 20, I think, or is that right, or 19? I can't remember
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah.
Which one was it?
I can't. It's 2019.
2019. That case 4000, which explicitly claims that seeking positive coverage or undue listening or whatever it's called, from a undue willingness to consider your views by a media outlet is soliciting a bribe, because they couldn't say positive coverage because Netanyahu received horrible coverage from the
Less
media.
hostile coverage, right? Less
Yeah,
hostile coverage.
media organ in question. But whatever the case, when you were making the case that this is fundamentally authoritarian, anti-democratic, that there is no democracy, the case that you also should, I mean, it said it's not just one side or another. Shaul Alovich and Noni Moses, the publishers of Walla News at the time and of Yediot Achronot still today, are also standing trial, right? And for providing bribes ostensibly, or offering bribes to Netanyahu in exchange for positive cover, in exchange for whatever regulatory things that he was supposed to do in each of those cases. We don't have to get into it, although in Noni Moses, it was to close down Israel Hayom. But in both of these cases, it's not just a criminalization of politics, it's also a criminalization of journalism. And there are two, or there's one very clearly ironic thing here, which is that the media, the liberal media, the establishment media, I guess is probably the best way to say it, in Israel has been a full participant. We were talking about Hadash Steif, the Army radio reporter who illegally hacked Effie Navez's phone, the phone of the head of the Bar Association, and then published this information, this salacious information about him illegally on Army radio, and working in full collusion with the Attorney General's office, with the state prosecution, with Shai Nitzan. She received immunity for her felony offenses, and then he used her feloniously procured information to indict Effie Navez of another invented crime of being bribed through sex by the judge Esti Kreif. So this whole chain of events shows that the media has been fully colluding with the state prosecution, with the police, in their efforts to criminalize Netanyahu and anybody who's pushing an agenda that is not to the liking of the legal fraternity. So here we get to last week. I think on Wednesday of last week, Eli Tzipori, who exposed just how absurd the case 4000 was from the regulatory perspective, from the telecommunications reporter for Globes at the time. He is now being criminally investigated because he has been in the courtroom every single day of Netanyahu's trial and simultaneously reporting on the procedures, because the judges refused to have cameras in the courtroom. So he's acting as the eyes and the ears of the public. And there's this sort of private initiative of a bunch of lawyers in Israel where he's providing a constant flow of information from the courtroom. And then you have 4 people who are outside who are discussing what's happening in real time in the courtroom, which is an incredibly important thing that they're doing. So Eli Tzipori, one of the witnesses in case 1000, which is about gifts that Netanyahu allegedly received counter to the law from his old friends. So one of the star witnesses, or the only star witness, was this woman named Hadass Klein, and her encounter in counter questioning by Netanyahu's attorneys, her entire narrative fell apart. But be that as it may, he was trying to show. He published a picture of her house. She lives in some palatial residence in Herzliya Pituach, very tony town in Israel, which is not illegal. But she filed a criminal complaint against him, saying that it was a form of harassment that he had published a picture of her house. And now he's under criminal investigation for it. So in a very real sense, we're seeing with Eli Tzipori coming under criminal investigation, that this is the flip side. This is what you were talking about as well in Netanyahu's hearing, that on the one hand, you have a criminalization of politics, and on the other hand, you have a criminalization of media. Now, it's not establishment politicians and it's not establishment media that have to worry about it, which is why they're colluding with this. It's everybody who's outside of the establishment.
Look, what they've done, just as they've made, everything criminal in politics, all reporting is criminal, right? And what does that mean, that all reporting is criminal, right? In this case, the alleged crime is acting against a witness. But this is not, by the way, this is not a new theory. They used this to go after the two senior communications people in Netanyahu. Illegally grabbed their phones, by the way, right?
Yeah.
The illegal seizure of the phones was recognized by the court. The court said, yes, the phones were illegally seized. And then court after court, going all the way up to the Supreme Court, said, even though they were illegally seized, you can keep them anyway, right? Police prosecution, they can do what they want with the illegally seized phones. And so this is, every part of the reporting process is illegal. If you say nice things about Netanyahu, it's a crime. Now, what does that mean about saying nice things about Lapid? It's criminal on its face too. You're just never going to be prosecuted for it, right? And so we have this situation, this insane situation, in which any member of the media, by simply reporting accurately that this case appears to be showing corruption of the prosecution, corruption of the police, corruption of the court system, that makes you a criminal. And you may be prosecuted. And if you are prosecuted, you will be convicted. And the striking thing about Eli Tzipori is only one thing, which is the new attorney general, the attorney general that Gideon Sa'ar appointed, with one aim in mind, continuing the prosecution of Netanyahu for the non-crime of media coverage. That new attorney general is completely in sync with this old approach of seeing that what's become the traditional approach of the prosecution, the police, that everything about reporting is illegal, and unless you enjoy unless you toe the line, unless you enjoy the confidence of the prosecution and the police.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that they were saying that Eli was intimidating Hadass Klein, but and I don't know how you make the case for that by publishing a picture of her house, but whatever. But Aviad Glickman, who is an establishment reporter, right? He is the mouthpiece of the prosecution. Everything that he says, he gets directly, sometimes in the middle of being, he's on the air and he's getting the information, and he's giving it as he reads his WhatsApp. But so Aviad Glickman actually, in front of the judges, intimidated Momo Filber, who was supposed to be the star witness against Netanyahu in case 4000, and he completely destroyed the prosecution's case. And Aviad Glickman in the courtroom intimidated him, and nothing happened to him at all. Nothing.
The perfect thing about selective prosecution is that you can't show the wrongdoing easily. Right? If let's say there were a case, let's say that the prosecution actually prosecuted real crimes, okay, not positive media coverage, but real bribes, okay, or real corruption, then the facts come out, it's there, the case is there, the case is not there, you get convicted, you don't get convicted. In something like this, everybody's always guilty, right? And so one of the things that the apologists for the prosecutors here say is, well, look, Netanyahu's getting his day in court, and he'll be convicted or he won't be convicted. And you can't really say that once you've agreed with this interpretation of the law, you can't really say it's wrong to convict Netanyahu, because Netanyahu, like everybody else in the world, is a criminal according to this interpretation, right? So the only thing you can say is it's selective. Of course, it is selective. That's the point of it, is to be selective. But you know, saying that it's selective is a great way for the prosecution to say, you're not really criticizing what we're doing. You're just saying, look at them.
Right. It's not that we're wrong to be prosecuting you. It's that we're wrong not to be prosecuting the other guy. But the whole point is that, no, you're wrong to pretend that
Right.
this is a crime to begin with.
Right, because the other guy will never be prosecuted, because that's the whole point of it. The whole point of it is to intimidate these guys and go after these guys, and not intimidate those guys and not go after those guys. But by fabricating crimes, they've created a system where they're hiding this from public overview. They're hiding it from the ability of the public to see what's going on.
But what's weird, also not weird, what's remarkable, Gali Baharav, who's the attorney general now, and I can never remember her name, and in a way I figure it's not really that important because they're interchangeable. They all do the same thing. But she
Barab
whatever. Anyway,
Gali
so
Barab.
All right, good. Anyway, you know her name. But I'm going to continue not to know her name, I think. But and hope that she gets fired. But the point here is, this week there was another story that came up, or last week, that Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz did the operation against Iran's Palestinian proxy Islamic Jihad in Gaza without first convening the National Security Cabinet, which is supposed to be the statutory body in Israel that approves taking these kinds of actions, and you're not supposed to take them without cabinet approval. And so a lot of people queried about this, because on its face it was an illegal thing to do. That they didn't tell any of the members of the security cabinet even that they were going to initiate these operations in Gaza. Ayelet Shaked, who was a member of the security cabinet, was asked in a radio interview whether when she found out that the operation was going to take place, and she said when she heard about it on the radio after it had already started. So the attorney general Barav Miara said, well, I decided, based upon the recommendations or the unanimous position of the general staff, that this would not lead to war, that there was no reason to do this. And so the interesting thing about here is twofold. First, it's not up to the generals to decide. If the law is to be taken seriously, then the law is saying that the people who have to decide whether a campaign of this nature is going to lead to war or not, that's not the general staff's decision to make. That's the elected leaders of the country's decision to make in the security cabinet, which is, again, the duly constituted statutory body to make these kinds of decisions. So that she's absconding of the powers of the elected officials by saying that it's enough to suffice with what the generals say. Now, I can argue that she's probably right, and that forcing a prime minister or a defense minister, both, to convene the security cabinet may be ridiculous. But here's the other thing, which is that this is how Mandelblit, her predecessor, the former attorney general who made prosecuting Netanyahu the only priority of his office, and as we saw with Saada's revelations, subordinated everything, including the rule of law itself, to achieving that goal. He forced Netanyahu to convene the security cabinet for everything, for any decision that he made in relation to anybody. He said everything had to be approved by the security cabinet, and to dilute Netanyahu's ability to make decisions on issues of war and peace, or of even national security, national strategic importance for Israel. So on the one hand, so the first question is whether Barav Miari can be right. The other question is, if she is right, what does that mean about what Mandelblit said? Maybe there's a third question that I can't think of.
So I think that what you said is absolutely right. That is, there's no way that she should be involved. It's not her job to approve or disapprove military actions, right? So is this something where the cabinet should meet and approve first? I think it is, but I don't think that it's ultimately a legal question. This is it's a question of the functioning of a democracy, and the first cut of the decision is the one that should be made by the elected officials. So I think you're absolutely right there. But I think that what Miao is doing here is what the prosecution and the police do in the cases of reporting and politics, which is she's saying that everything is presumptively illegal, but I can make it legal if I want. Right. And so what that means is that if Netanyahu does it, it's illegal. And if anybody else does it, it's perfectly legal, right? And
but the decision-making power is mine, right? I mean, that's the
right,
other thing.
exactly.
She's saying that
and that's
Lapid needed to get my okay to do what he did, but I gave him the okay. But he needed, but first, the most important thing that she's saying is he needed to get my approval. That's what she's
exactly
saying.
And that's what she did, right? With the Gantz, the defense minister, wants to approve a new chief of staff of the army during election season. If Netanyahu had done this, obviously the attorney general, right, the attorney general would claim that he lacks the authority because it's caretaker government, and besides, it's corrupt and presumptively a breach of trust and therefore criminal. But Gantz is not Netanyahu, and so therefore it's okay. But what she said was, she didn't say, obviously, according to the law, the defense minister has the right to approve with the government's approval a new chief of staff. What she said was, well, I have to examine it. And then I've examined the secret memo that I got from Gantz, and having examined the secret memo, I'm convinced that it's lawful. Right, so that we can preserve the general default. Every decision of government is illegal, and they're only going to knock it down. They're only going to find it to have been illegal, in fact, if it's Netanyahu making the decision.
Well, I think in a way we have to we can end it with that with you, but I do think we've gone to the point, and I see it also very clearly in the United States, and it was manifested so clearly with the Trump thing. I mean, some people like David French, I think, are saying, well, we have to see what was in the search warrant, but that's missing the whole point. It's not. Trump is being hounded, with the Russia collusion hoax and everything that followed from there, the Carter Page memo and eavesdropping on his electronic communications, because he's an enemy of this concept that the security state can rule a democracy, that they can swallow up the organs of an elected republic or democracy, and they can do these sorts of things and decide what is permitted and what is not permitted based upon how it empowers or disempowers them or undermines their power as institutions and as political actors. And I think the same thing we're seeing over and over and over again in Israel, that we are in a what's it called, an Alice in Wonderland situation, right, where we've moved past a question of what is legal and what is illegal, because these unelected jurists have decided that they are the law, and they use the language of law. They are waging lawfare against Israel the same way that their counterparts in the FBI and the Justice Department in Washington are waging lawfare against Trump and his supporters. That's your son in the background. I just want everybody to understand that it's not like sound effect. It's actually your son who's making this very, very cute noises. So everybody should know that.
Yes, I don't know if you can make out that he was requesting an apple.
I'm glad that you understood baby. At least your baby. Because when my kid said that, he was saying he had to go to the bathroom, but or be changed.
But yeah, I think that that's absolutely right. I mean, what you're seeing is this broader assault on democracy using the language of law. And there are two casualties. There is democracy and law, right? That is, if law can be used this way, law can no longer be an effective tool for anything because it's become completely malleable and political and can be used to take out political enemies in the US to take out the Republicans and in Israel to take out the Likud. Right? But it's also it's the death of democracy, right? That is, you don't get to elect leaders who make decisions. You
Even
just
if
sit
you
back
elect,
as these.
but it's important for people to understand, even if you're electing Biden, even if you're electing Lapid, you're not electing them. They rule at the pleasure of the jurists. And if they don't do what the jurists say, then then Hunter Biden is suddenly going to find himself under federal subpoena and he's going to be tried. And all of these things are going to happen to Lapid. Is going to be tried for all of the gifts that he got and for all of the influence that he peddled with the media, and who knows what else they have on him. But he's going to be paying the price for whatever it is that he did or did not do if he doesn't follow the line. And that's something that, that the left, the progressives in Israel and the United States don't care about. And I'll tell you, and in my closing, because I also want to talk about that, which is what is the political agenda here, which you're of the opinion that it's mainly just about power. And my view is that it's about power and a certain ideology.
I think there have been cases in Israel where they've gone after left-wing officials. They're much rarer, but they've happened. Right? So back in the day, the Attorney General in 1977, forced Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was, the head of the Labor Party, the left-wing Labor Party, to resign the Prime Minister's office over some triviality of an unreported bank account that was held by his wife in Washington, D.C. Right?
From when Rabin was the ambassador.
From when he was the ambassador. That's right. And what was that about? Barak was an ideological ally of Aaron Barak, the Attorney General at the time. It was an ideological ally of Yitzhak Rabin. He wasn't trying to drive the Labor Party from power. The truth is, if he'd known that he was going to endanger Labor in the elections, I don't think that he would have done it. But the reason that he was interested in that prosecution was to establish the primacy of the Attorney General over the Prime Minister. Prime ministers, they're politicians. They run for office. That's the lower form. Like attorney generals claim the imprimatur of the law, that is of God, right? And that's what that fight was about then. And I think that's primarily what the fight is about still today. The attorney general, the prosecutors, the police are trying to establish their authority over society, to take over, to supplant the democracy with what they call the rule of law, which means the rule of them, these lawyers.
Right. I think that here we have to add in one last thing, and this is where I want to end it, with your permission, unless you have something that you also want to add, which is that one of the very key things, one of the major things that Moshe Saada also exposed that wasn't related specifically to Netanyahu was how the police and the police investigations unit and the attorney generals, the state prosecution, killed an investigation of the death of a 17-year-old named Ahuvia Sandak in December 2020. So Ahuvia Sandak was in the Benjamin region of which is under Samaria in the West Bank with his friends, and they were driving on a road, and the police, which is very politicized in Judea and Samaria, very anti Jewish communities and activists in in Judea and Samaria and has been for a very long time. A squad car started chasing them, and they went through a roadblock, and they were in an old jalopy. And so the police starts a high-speed chase against this old jalopy, and the police cruiser drove into, like, sideswiped the car. And because it was an old jalopy, it turned over. And I think five of the people, there were 6 people in the car. I think 5 of them were either moderately or lightly wounded, and the 6th, Ahuvia Sandak, died. And so, and instead of investigating the police for causing the accident, they arrested the survivors. They criminalized Ahuvia Sadak, who was 17. And Roni Ritman, is what Sada was saying, was that he went on TV attacking them. The Karen Baror, who is the head of the investigations unit, who's been colluding in all of this, refused to investigate, did not bring the police in for questioning, would not do it for, I think, 4 days. And in the meantime, they had managed to coordinate their positions and attack.
Clear up the crime scene.
Right, they cleared up the crime scene. They did everything to block any real investigation of what they had done. And you had these young people who were screaming and saying that the police caused the accident. And what Sada said was that Karen Baron, he believes, is a radical leftist. She had said at the outset of her tenure, which I think was in 2018, as the head of the police investigations unit, that she doesn't believe in singing Hatikva, Israel's national anthem, because it makes Arabs uncomfortable. So here's a woman who takes a knee to Israel's national anthem, opposes it because it's too Zionist. And she's running these investigations. She's obstructing the investigation of Ahuvia Sandak's death. And then there were all of these protests where his supporters, his friends, his parents were on the side of the road, and the police was beating them. This was going on for like a year of protests, and every single one of them was violently quelled by the police. So the police are continuing to beat them. Nobody is investigating them. And then you have the head of police investigations unit, who has made statements indicating her radical political views. Shai Nitzan was the same. Meni Mazuz, who was another predecessor of Avichai Mandelblit as Attorney General, very, very far to the left. And so you are seeing a radical anti-Zionist political agenda. And by the way, anti-God also, if you talk about the law making them God. So you have people like Dina Zilber, who was Avichai Mandelblit's deputy, I think, in the Attorney General's office, and she was shutting down all of these Orthodox events, all of these events for religious Jews that were in keeping with Jewish law, because they were women only or men only, and saying you're not allowed to have that. Of course, she never did that in the Muslim sector against Muslim communities in Israel, only against Jews. So they've been waging this war against Orthodox Judaism, war against religious law, halacha, at the same time that they're advancing their progressive agenda by enforcement or non-enforcement of laws as they define them. So I think that while power for power's sake, for seizure of power, absolute power over politics, over the media, over all aspects of Israeli life in the name of themselves is perhaps a key component here. I don't think that you can divorce what they're doing from a very clear political agenda. You also can't ignore that the first places that we saw this kind of activism, both of justices and of lawyers, was in their actions against the Jewish communities of Judea and Samaria. And they've been going to war, and also Jewish settlement in the Galilee and other places, that their longest track record has been against Zionism, against Jewish settlement of the land of Israel, whether in Judea and Samaria or in the Galilee or in the Negev or anywhere else. And so all of these things are part of a whole. There is a political agenda, there is an ideological agenda, and they're merged in this lawfare that Israel's establishment, like the American establishment, is carrying out against we the people. So I think, when we're talking about America going to the polls in November for Congress and Israel going to the polls again for the Knesset, think that however you want to look at specific things that happened, whether you like the operation in Gaza or you don't like it, whether you like what they're doing on inflation or you don't like it, whether you like what they're doing on energy policies or you don't like it, the only real question is, what kind of country do we want to be in? And right now we're in a country where unelected lawyers and law enforcement officers are ruling the roost, and they're obstructing the law, and they're trouncing our democratic institutions. And one side supports that, and one side opposes it because it's being victimized by it. And that's what is on the ballot in November in Israel and the United States, I think. And I think that these are critical elections in both countries. So unless you want the last word, which I'll be happy to give to you, Avi, you don't want
said it all.
All right, then we're going to leave it at that, guys. So that's another edition of the Mideast News Hour, which is probably a little bit more than an hour, but you'll forgive me for that. And we'll see you here again next week and talking about other things. Thank you so much for listening. See you later.